Welcome, everybody. I'm David Mattis. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools. It's a pleasure to see everyone here as we have our webinar today that's focusing on the role of the board president. I'm joined by Mary Catherine Duffy, our Director of Professional Development. MK, good afternoon.
Hello, everyone.
And it's such a pleasure to see our panelists. We're going to have Mary Catherine introduce our panelists in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to address a couple of housekeeping items. First, there will be a recording made available to our members that can be found in the webinar library. If you use your login credentials, you can access the webinar library and find this and all of our other webinars as well that you can view on demand. If you need credentials or you need to recover your credentials, just call my assistant, Pat Blevins, in the office, and she'll make sure to assist you with that. Also, the way to communicate with us, ask questions, ask for clarification, anything along those lines, is by using the Q&A box. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. If you click on that, then you'll be able to type in questions or anything you would like to share with the panelists. We're going to make sure that we have time for Q&A today. And so make sure to use that Q&A box as much as you would like. And just go ahead and if you capture a great question, type it in, get it into the queue. Don't worry, don't risk losing it by not typing it in, because we're not at a stopping point. Make sure to capture all of your questions and get those typed into the Q&A box. So again, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Mary Catherine to introduce our two panelists today.
Well, thanks, David. We're so excited to have these panelists because I think one of the things that we've talked a lot about is that we want to not just offer our own perspectives, but to offer perspectives of people who are, have boots on the ground. And so we're happy to have Calvin Simpson and Melanie Hartfield, who have agreed to spend some time with us to talk about their time as board president. So I want to tell you a little bit about Melanie first. Melanie currently serves as the Director of Advancement at All Saints Episcopal in Beaumont. All four of her children attended that school. All Saints is a pre-K through 8th grade school with an enrollment of 340. And prior to serving on staff at All Saints, Melanie volunteered for many years as a Board of Trustees member and is then as a board chair. Calvin is from Victoria, Texas. He currently serves on the board at Trinity Episcopal. He has two daughters. The oldest is in 7th and the youngest is in 5th. And he owns a small business in Victoria. He started serving on Trinity's board in the 17-18 school year. Served as president-elect in 18-19 and was in charge of the head of school search committee. 19-20 was his year as president, and he is currently going to serve 2 more years in a capacity yet to be determined. So that's a little iffy, Calvin. I'm not sure that you shouldn't have determined that beforehand, but that's okay. So Melanie and Calvin, we're really glad to have you on, and I'm going to turn it back over to David, who will facilitate.
Yeah, that's not uncommon for good board presidents to we make sure they don't get too far away. So, but yeah, he may be immediate past president in charge of solving everything. So we'll see what that looks like as the year unfolds. Well, again, thank you for our panelists taking the time to join us today. We've got two just amazing, strong veterans, and it's so nice to have them with us here today. Let's go ahead and get the slide deck rolling, and let's talk about board presidency in general. So, it's a fun activity to poll the community and ask them what they think the board president does, because there's a pretty wide range of how different people answer the question of what a board president does. You're the lead dog, you're the communicator, making sure all the different pieces are fitting together. You're the cheerleader without a doubt. You're the, in a tug of war situation, you're at the top of the rope, just making sure that, encouraging the team if you've got a big lift that's coming up this year. You're all sorts of things, but really at one level, you're a coach as well. You're coaching your board. You're also coaching the head of school. So there's a big element of coaching that goes along with this. So I've got a kickoff question for our two veteran board presidents. But before I do that, I'd like to ask all of our participants today, if there are any burning questions that you brought. Make sure to enter those into the Q&A box right now. Mary Catherine, keep an eye on that. We'll make sure you get all of your questions answered. But what I found is that when most people sign up for this webinar in particular, there's one or two things that they're really kind of scratching their head about. And so if you brought any of those types of questions, now's a great time to enter those into the Q&A box. While everyone is doing that, let me turn to Calvin. And Calvin, when you and me and Melanie and Mary Catherine were all getting together talking about this webinar, one of the things that we played with was the idea of what's one of the most important things that a board president can do. And I'd like to hear, your response. Again, we don't get into, as much specificity as we did in the pre-planning, but you had a phrase that talked about making sure you knew how to hold your tongue. And could you just talk a little bit more in general about what you mean by that?
The biggest thing is when inevitably you're going to get calls from other parents from the school, then they're going to want you to solve a issue, or they're going to complain to you. And the biggest thing that you need to do is not answer their question immediately. You need to let them know they need to go talk to the head of school. Many times they probably did talk to the head of school and they got an answer they didn't like. So now they're coming to you. And you need to be aligned with the head of school. The head of school runs the day-to-day operations of the school. That's not the board president's job. The board president is there to be a supporter and a friend and a consultant.
And it's so hard because lots of times when they're coming to you, like you said, they may have gone to the head of school, received an answer they didn't like, and so they're trying to come to you to get a different answer. And lots of times emotions are high in that as well. So being able to really put your active listening hat on and doing listening more than talking in those conversations, critically important. Melanie, what about from your perspective? What's one of the most important things that you did to be a successful board president?
Well, I think probably at the beginning of the board year, it's really important to make sure that every member of the board feels that they are in a place where they can contribute their talents and their expertise in the best way possible, so that they feel really valued and that their work is important to the success of the goals of the board. So, and that is, we're getting ready to have our new board member orientation next week. And that is interviewing those new board members, especially to find out where their passions lie, so that you can make sure that they're on the working committee that suits, their personality, their gifts the very best. Because I feel like being able to build a strong and active board, making sure that people feel valuable and that their time and effort is well spent, will lead to the most productive board you could possibly have.
I think so. And that board culture piece is so critical, creating an environment where opinions are, people feel like they can share their opinions freely. At the core, that's trust. Mm-hmm. People get into a situation like that when they feel like they can trust the people around the boardroom. And so as a board president, you play an integral role in creating that community of trust, which pays in dividends. Mm-hmm. When you're in a situation where you really need everyone to have their creative problem solving hat on. Mary Catherine, your thoughts from the head of school perspective when you served in that role. I asked our two heads what they did to make sure they were successful to make sure they were successful board presidents. As a head of school, what was the most important thing that a board president could do to support you in your work?
I'm going to say trust. I think they have both said some really important things. And from the perspective of a head of school, knowing you can trust your board chair is critical. I felt like that the times that I had a really trustworthy board chair, that I just felt like a weight was lifted off of me, because I knew that I could talk about things that were sensitive or difficult, or that I wasn't sure how to solve the problem. And what I was looking for was somebody who could listen and offer a perspective that maybe I didn't have, but I had to have that trust in order to do that. Because if I thought maybe it was going to get out, because there's so many things, we talk about this all the time with boards. There are so many things that we need to talk about that may be really bad ideas, or maybe really unsolvable problems or whatever, we need to be able to talk about that stuff and know that it's not going to get out. And so as a head of school, when you have trust with your board chair and you know that you can talk about things and oftentimes people, because that's what we're dealing with, is we're dealing with people, whether it's I've got an issue with a teacher or I've got a parent who's upset or whatever. Knowing I could talk to my board chair was critical. And there were years that I couldn't. And then the many years that most years I could. And that made for a much better experience for me as a head of school.
Thanks for that. Well, hey, let's take a look at a few different ideas. What I want to do first, before we get into what I call the president's playbook, is to start exploring a few themes that are coming to the surface in connection with COVID. And that's actually one of the first questions that we see in the Q&A box. No surprise there. So before we handle that question specifically, here are 4 themes that I think boards and especially board presidents should reflect upon, because they're going to be important for this upcoming year. So the first is, how is the school keeping up with the ever-shifting landscape? So what I mean by that is, I think there's too much going on, and I think all of the different guidances, all the different monitoring, all the different policy developments, planning, all of those things, it feels like it's too much for one head of school to be able to handle. So what we're seeing in a lot of our successful schools is they're creating some type of committee, combination of sometimes board members and senior administration, to really try to make sure that everyone has their arms around the latest guidances, and also making sure the school's in a position to create the policies and the procedures they need in place. For example, when a student gets sick, when a faculty member gets sick, just to make sure that all of those policies are in place. That's the first thing. The second theme is, this year more than ever, you're going to need to get the most out of your board meetings. What I mean by that is strategic and fiduciary conversations should take priority 1. So things that can be reduced to written reports, the use of a consent calendar, all of those things should be used as much as possible this year, especially in the fall semester, so that when the board does come together, there's plenty of time to have strategic and fiduciary conversations. The other thing is the generative conversation. What I mean by generative is a fancy way of saying, what are we doing today to make sure the school is going to be open when our kids have kids? What are we doing to make sure we save the mission for the next generation? The generative conversation that's going to be on the horizon is enrollment management. So the reason I say that is, we're coming out of one of the largest economic expansions in a long time. For schools that were having challenges with enrollment management during one of the best economic chapters in recent history, that's not going to change as we enter into a more challenging economic period. So if enrollment management has been a challenge, it's going to be more of a challenge. If you're in a community where enrollment management has not especially been a challenge, if you're blessed to have a wait list, those kinds of things, there's no guarantee that's going to continue. So if you haven't had to have deep conversations about enrollment management, I suspect you will in the next coming years, just because of the economic situation that we're facing.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
You may want to answer this question at the end of this slide, but I want to give it to you because it's kind of what you're talking about. With the uncharted waters of COVID, how can the board and head work together to address parent concerns and needs without interrupting or disrupting the head's authority in day-to-day operations? You kind of touched on this part. It seems like the decisions about COVID risk management are larger than the head's responsibility, and that the community should influence the strategy for the return to campus and delivery of programs.
So yeah, it's a bit of a challenge now, because things that we used to consider to be clearly administrative calls are going to get bumped into a different lane because of the health and safety issue. So I think what I'm going to do is, let's take an example. Are we going to require masks? If we're going to require masks, what age are we going to require masks? That's a hot topic right now. I'm actually going to hold that until we get to the lane slide, if that's okay, because that lane slide is a good illustration of that question. So let's hold on to that, if that's okay. But make sure when we get to the lane slide, we come back to that, because things are different are more challenging in that area because of the circumstances that we have. But that's a great question. We'll come back to that, I promise. Yeah.
I was just going to say that at All Saints, we created a task force early in the summer of community members, medical professionals, board members. It was a broad range of about 20 different people that had different areas of expertise. But it was clear from the beginning, and we stated it right from the very first meeting, that all of the recommendations would be presented to the head of school for their final approval. So it is tricky because so many of the details down to the mask wearing and which grade level and for what period of time, all of that's operational, but we needed the consensus from this broad range of people and all these different areas of expertise. So when we presented it to our parents, it came with that authority of having been really well researched, but from the beginning, making it really clear that still it had to be approved by, the admin team, and that ultimately the head of school helped a lot.
Yeah, and that's a great way to do that. And let's just go to that right now, because I know that's a front of mind question. So let's just spend a little bit of time with that right now. And what were some of the questions that came up, Melanie? I'm sure masks. What were some of the other specifics that came up beyond masks?
Masks, whether teachers would travel between classes, or
right.
Classes would travel, PE, whether we would have PE,
exactly,
whether we would have recess.
Even the whole, whether we reopen virtually, whether we open partially virtually, partially not. I mean, that's a huge question that's just out in the open.
So let's take a look at that. In a normal year, those would be operational questions. No question about it. Are we going to have PE? That's purely a program. Or what's the lunch configuration going to be? All that's program. Questions about utilization of teachers, staffing, all those things. Those are clearly operational matters. So in a normal year, those are pretty much the head's call. Now, the head may or may not seek board's advice in making those decisions based on what they may be. They could. But the challenge with this year is those kinds of questions really get bumped up here, possibly here, but I think to this level, because why? Health and safety is an issue. So if we were looking at the fiduciary strategic generative map, which are the three big things that the board has to be responsible for, this is all fiduciary. Why? Because we're talking about keeping the place safe. Talking about keeping our faculty safe, our kids safe, those things. So they're not operational. And that was a lot of schools really struggled with that because some folks thought, well, the mask question, for example, that's like a dress code issue. We would never get involved with that as a board. Well, I don't think so, because we're going into health and safety. So what we're finding in COVID is that this chart, which normally, 9 times out of 10 answers all of our questions pretty easily, these lanes may be a little bit different this year because so many of the operational questions are now taking on health, safety, fiduciary parameters, if that makes sense. So how do we do that? How do we maintain the head's lane? How do we maintain the head being the chief executive officer of the organization while recognizing there's overlap between those decisions and what the board has to do? Well, I like Melanie's approach. I mean, it's a partnership, and maybe you use the middle lane as an example, even if it's fiduciary items. And we realize, you know what, these are shared decisions. These are no longer purely operational because of the possible ramification of what that decision could yield. So at the minimum, it's a partnership lane. So going back to the specific question, let's see if I can pull that up. It seems like decisions about COVID risk management are larger than the head's responsibility. Yes, they are larger than the head's responsibility. Why? Because they go directly to the health and safety of the community. And the community should, and here's the other part of that question, and that the community should influence the strategy for the return to campus and the delivery of programs. Well, I think the community's input should be taken into consideration. How much I mean, when we're getting into strategy and making decisions, we should take the community's input, but it's not like a referendum. We're not going to vote, for example, on whether or not we're going to have hybrid school or online school. We're not going to vote, for example, whether or not we're going to offer 100% in person. Why? Because there are larger strategic and fiduciary questions to take into consideration. Mary Catherine, do you have thoughts about that? I want to draw a line of distinction there, saying it's not, these kinds of things aren't referendums, because
Right.
board's responsibility to make these kinds of decisions and give the direction to the head of school. But that being said, obviously the concerns and input from the community have to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it would be foolish not to seek input from your community, but just like everything else, I think that ultimately it's the board and the head working in partnership to make those decisions. And I think with regard to board chairs, since this is a board president, something that comes to mind for me is the role of the president in guiding that,
Right.
and influencing board members to understand that as we're making these shared decisions, we have to work as a board. We used to use the example, the word picture of take off our parent hat and put on our board hat, right? And so the board president's role in that for me is to be the leader and guide that. So for example, in a practical example, if we're talking about something where you've got, let's say it's masks, and you've got maybe a board member who maybe they're on one end of the spectrum or another, the board president may have to kind of guide the board and say, now, wait a minute, are we wearing our board hat here? That's something that I think board presidents need to be able to do. It's really hard to do because a lot of times you're the board president in a board with your colleagues or your peers or people that you hang out with. But the reality is that that's the role of the board chair, is to make sure that we're working in partnership, to make sure that everyone on the board kind of, and this speaks a little bit to what Melanie talked about when you know your board, as a board chair, you know who's on your board and what their passions are and what they're good at. That can be helpful. So, my thought is just that as you do make those decisions, the board president's role is heightened a little bit as they lead and coach their board on what's appropriate and what's not. Is that the kind of answer?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, again, the role of the board president, and you've got to kind of have your eye on a couple things. You've got to have your eye on leading the conversation. You have to, as Melanie noted, have to keep your eye on framing the situation in a way where it still is the head's decision, finally, if that makes sense. And so it's a little bit, if you go the committee route, let's say we're going to have a COVID committee that's going to make recommendations, then yeah, you frame it that way. This is a committee that the board has instructed to make recommendations to the head of school, and you frame it that way. I think that makes sense.
And I think, David, this year, especially because of the blurriness between operational, strategic, keeping our, the board in its proper lane. I don't know that there is really a proper lane this year because of COVID. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think more than ever, it's important for the board president to have regular conversations with the head of school, yeah. Really calendaring that very regularly and having that open conversation about, and are we doing what we need to do to help you? Are we getting to direct or trying to direct things in a detailed way? Or, just having that regular conversation about making sure that the board is operating in the best way possible to support the head is more important than ever before.
And so let's talk a little bit about that. Talk to me, Melanie. I'm going to ask Calvin as well. When you were president of the board, how frequently did you have sit down, hour-long rich conversations with your head of school?
I think when I was board president, we would do a once a month meeting prior to the board meeting, and that's when things were in a pretty stable situation. We didn't have anything like this going on. So, but I can envision this year, it would be more like, once a week at least. either by phone or clearly by phone or Zoom or whatever, but just more frequently and intentionally making sure that, 2 weeks doesn't go by without touching base and in a pretty in-depth way.
Calvin, when you were board president, how often did you meet with the board, with the head of school?
Probably 2 to 3 times a month. Some of them planned, some of them impromptu. I was on the finance committee, so I also was responsible for signing checks. So I would be up there every so often to do that. And it just seemed like a 5-minute check signing visit turned into an hour to an hour and a half long chat session.
Right.
We would, and I think that goes with what Melanie was talking earlier, and what Mary Catherine was. We had that open relationship where we did sit down and talk about those interesting things, things that didn't need to go out of that office, just bouncing ideas. We would text a lot. There was things that, if I might have, my daughter, they're in a very large class at the school, and a class above them had some controversial parents in it, and the kids would hear things and they'd tell me stuff, and then I would text her, say, hey, this is what I'm hearing, the intel. But we just had that kind of relationship. So we communicated a lot.
I'm going to tell you that, Calvin, thank you for saying that, because I can't tell you how helpful it was for me as a head of school, when I would much rather have gotten a heads up on what you're hearing. I mean, I don't know about other heads of school, but when I walked in the room, crickets, I wasn't going to hear it. And it was helpful. I would much rather have had my board chair say, hey, this is the latest in 3rd grade that you ought to know about, because then I can, preemptively strike, or at least pay attention. And so I just think that's really super helpful. And that's well said. I'm glad you said that.
Well, and I coach board presidents and board members as well. I've never met a head of school that's told me, wow, I wish I knew less about what was going on in my community.
Right.
Now, it can become not as constructive if it's this. I'm hearing A, B, and C, and I need you to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
At that, it ceases to be constructive at that point, because at that point, you're no longer providing intel, but you're providing directive.
Right.
And so that's a slightly less helpful situation, as opposed to making sure that you're sharing intel with the head of school. Now, if your head of school then says, oh, wow, thanks so much for that, what do you think we should do about that? Lots of head of schools like to use their board president that way. And then I think that's completely appropriate. But volunteering the information along with, and I want you to do this, can sometimes not be as constructive as just saying, here's what I'm hearing. I'm happy to be a thought partner with you on this. If you want to talk about different ideas, I'd love to do that. But I know you got it. But just wanted to let you know that that's out there.
Right.
Okay, let's take a look. One other COVID theme I want to throw out, just because I think this is important for board presidents. If you're in a parochial environment, this year more than ever, going back to the lanes, and the fact that the lanes are just a suggestion this year. If we were looking at governance, we would look at different lanes between school, parish, and diocese. And in the same way that the lanes are a little bit blurred between head of school, board president, board, the lanes are a little blurred between school, parish, and diocese this year. Why? Because matters that a parish or a diocese would normally not get involved in, we're seeing them being involved in this year. Why? Because the same reason. It's a fiduciary situation. So for example, a diocese very rarely, if ever, wants to talk to you about, how are you reopening this year? What does recess look like? How are you doing, A, B, and C? In a normal year, that's completely inappropriate for a diocese to get involved at that level of minutia. This year, it's very different, because there's liability, there's fiduciary, there's health and safety, those things as well. So I'm telling heads of school, board presidents, boards,
don't be surprised if you're hearing a little more communication from the parish or the diocese this year. No reason to be alarmed. And also be proactive. In some dioceses, you're required to share your reopening plans. Not all dioceses, but even if you're not, it's not a bad idea to reach out to the diocese and say, hey, we just want you to know here are all the steps that we've taken to make sure our reopening is safe and that everyone is healthy. We want you to have that information. Let us know if you have any questions. So Mary Catherine is in a diocesan role. Do you have any other comments about that, MK?
Well, no, just to, I think to reiterate as that I think from our perspective in the Diocese of West Texas, our bishop just really wanted to ensure that there was as much collaboration between the church and school as possible when it comes to the reopening, simply because we share space, we share the sanctuary, we share all kinds of things, and some churches are not opening yet, and some schools are opening because, and some churches that that have schools might be churches that have a much older congregation or whatever. And so we've had a lot of collaboration from the diocese around just making sure that the church and the school were working together. I think the whole, the issues that we've run into, at least in our diocese, regarding local orders and making sure that the Family Leave Act, that those changes that our diocese has done a really good job of making sure that we are informed as schools about the things that are happening, and that we're offering support to our schools when it comes to what should you be thinking about.
Right.
And so I think from our perspective, that's where the diocese has come in kind of as a steady hand, more so than a strong arm, and said, hey, we want to be helpful and we know that you need to open, but here's what we want to see so that everybody's safe. And I think it's gone well. It's required a little bit more than, as you said, we normally would have. And I can assure you that when this is all over, I'm sure that the diocese is not going to be interested in hearing from me much at all. But until it's over, they are trying to be a support to our schools rather than a hindrance.
Thanks for that. So let's take a look at some plays to call. So again, thinking of the president's role as a coach, team manager, what are some important plays that you may want to call? Well, Melanie's already mentioned this first one. I think play number one is be very intentional about cultivating a positive board culture. I've got a couple of quotes. The Drucker quote that says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So no matter how great your strategy is, if you don't have a healthy board culture, you'll never be as productive as you could be. And then culture just isn't one aspect of the game, it is the game. So at the highest level, the board president is a dominant role in setting whether or not you will have a positive board culture. Full stop. The board president's role is probably one of the largest factors in that. So here's another Drucker quote. Leadership is lifting a person's vision to high heights, the raising of a person's performance to a higher standard, and the building of a personality beyond its normal limitations. We've got egos to manage. We've got personalities to manage. We've got boards that also have lots of current parent board members, which is an interesting challenge to navigate as well. And it's the board president's job that really is going to consistently lift the members of the board up to a higher level, not just to make sure they're advocating for their individual kiddo, make sure they're not just advocating for their kiddo's class, whatever that, lower level may be. The board president's job is to consistently lift the vision up to those higher levels. So what are hallmarks of a healthy board culture? So when we work with schools, here's some things that we see that indicate, okay, yeah, this is a pretty healthy board culture. First and foremost, healthy and respectful partnership between the board and the head of school. We've talked about that a little bit. Are they meeting regularly? Is there communication? Is there a free exchange of perspectives and opinions? Behind closed doors, is the board president able to tell the head of school, you know what? I think we misplayed that. Here's what we need to do now. Is the head of school able to tell the board president, oh my gosh, I'm getting beaten up by one particular board member because they're doing some things that are not ideal. Can you come to my assistance and help me with that? That's an example of a healthy and respectful partnership, recognizing that the board president and the board, not the CEO of the organization, not the court of last appeals for administrative decisions, but rather the governing body of the organization, and an understanding of what the governing body's role is compared to what the head of school's role is. So that's one hallmark. Trust and candor among board members. That's another hallmark. Do we know how to disagree? Can we disagree? Can we keep confidences? Do we trust each other enough to know if I throw an idea out here, I know it's not going to be the subject of conversation at the coffee shop or at the carpool line or wherever. Thoughtful and productive resolution of issues. Can we resolve things, or once we make a decision, do we keep coming back to it? Are we thoughtful in how we take data in and how we make decisions? And then finally, that willingness to address poor board behavior. Boards that are strong do things like an annual self-evaluation, where they look at things such as attendance. Are board members prepared for all the meetings? Have they read the packet? Do they contribute in a constructive way? Do they understand the difference between being a parent and being a parent board member? All those things. If you're not doing an annual evaluation, it's a little bit hard to address poor behavior until it becomes a real problem. And what we want to do is create a culture where each board member can identify, okay, that may be a problem. We need to say something to that board member about that, or encourage our president to do that, and know that we've got our president's back. What about the other side? Warning signs. So as a board president, if you're seeing any of these things, this doesn't mean it's the end of the world, but it may mean that you've got to kind of think about what board culture do we currently have and what are the areas of improvement. So what are some examples of warning signs? Cliques. Are there cliques within the board? Are there, a handful of board members that just have become their own committee? Friendships, cliques, not necessarily a problem. It can be a problem if that affects how the board functions as a whole. Here's another good one. Are there meetings after the meeting? That's always a good sign that there may be a challenge. Normally that's a trust warning light. So is there a board meeting? Is everyone given an opportunity to express different opinions, different viewpoints? Is it quiet, relatively friendly and congenial? And then as soon as the meeting's over, are there pockets of conversations around cars or wherever people gather after the meeting where the real meeting takes place? I think every board, Mary Catherine, did you have experience with that? I think every board at some point or another has had experience with trying to figure out the meeting after the meeting.
Yeah, I think, I'll tell you that for the most part over my years, we did not have much of that, but here and there, yes, and that it's happening. And I think part of what, and you're going to speak to you, I think you kind of said something about this in the prior slide, but for me, the answer to that is that the board chair is willing to have a difficult conversation. The board chair is willing to lead in that way and to say to whoever's doing that, hey, we need you on board to be a part of, let's have the meeting in the meeting. But if it gets ignored, it's going to continue to happen. And so that's where I think the board chair can really step up to the plate and have what can be a tough conversation about it, but an important one.
Let me throw it open to Melanie or Calvin. Have you all had any experience with boards that kind of had meetings after meetings?
Oh yeah.
What so you want to, again, we don't need to get into specifics, but what let me ask you this. What do you think that was an indicator of? Why do you think that was happening?
I think more of it was head of school may have done some things that a certain board member didn't like, and that certain board member just wanted it known that they didn't like what that person was doing. And sometimes, in our case, it was it was a personality conflict
Yeah.
at a school
And,
person.
and that can really be dangerous. I mean, that can be, one of the things that I think is dismissible behavior is if a board member is speaking publicly and in a derogatory way about the head of school. I mean, you can't sit on a board where you've got a fiduciary responsibility to protect the board, and then in a public format say negative things about the decisions that the board has made, individual board members, or the head of school. Sometimes that's an indicator that we need to work on the head support and evaluation process. So when I've worked with schools that have had that as a problem, when you dig into it, part of the problem is there's not a constructive way or a constructive process in place for board members to air concerns they have about either the board or the head of school. So, sometimes that's the diagnosis, and board members need to be able to air concerns and say that, I think we may be off base here, either with heads decisions or with decisions that the board is making, but you have to be very intentional about how it's done. And if there's not a healthy process for those issues to be brought to the table, then you tend to get what you just described, Calvin. Folks are going to blow that steam off somehow. They're going to push that anxiety off somehow. And if there's not a formalized process for that, they're going to do the next best thing, which is be it the meeting after the meeting, the carpool line, or whatever. Mary Catherine, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I think that's right. And I think it's often has to do with there's not a process. It can also have to do with it that maybe there is a process, but we didn't onboard our board members well enough to teach them how to handle. Nobody's asking that we not have grievances or issues or concerns. What we're asking is that you do it appropriately. And
Right.
And so I think the role of the board chair comes into play here, where they insist, the board president is going to insist that we do an onboarding, that we talk about this particular thing at the, how do we handle when you don't agree with something? How do you handle, this is the actual process that we'd like you to go through if you're in a situation where you're concerned. Here's what we don't want you to do. We don't want you to have a meeting after the meeting. We don't want you to talk about the head of school at a cocktail party or a birthday party. This is how you do it. And I think sometimes it's just simply a matter of people haven't been taught what the process is.
Yeah. So another warning sign is overuse of the executive committee. So what we sometimes see is that the executive committee really assumes the role of governing board, and the executive committee starts making all of the decisions. Everything is scripted, everything is done ahead of time, and then when we get into the board meeting, it's just basically a matter of the larger board rubber stamping everything the executive committee has done. That can be a warning sign. I mean, obviously the executive committee is going to meet way more frequently than the full board. Obviously, the executive committee is going to play a role in making decisions between board meetings and also in, coaching the head of school. But we have seen situations where there's an overuse of the executive committee. And what that will do is minimize other board members from being able to get fully plugged in to their role of being the fiduciary, the strategic thinker, and the generative thinker for the board. In the same way that the members of the executive committee are. So while their roles are different, we have seen an overuse of the executive committee to the detriment of the full board. That can be a warning sign. And then this last one is a little bit weird. You wouldn't think it would be a problem for there to be closeness between the head and the president. We've just talked about trust and the importance of the head and president being able to freely exchange ideas. But actually, we have seen situations where the relationship can be so close that can also shut out other executive committee members and other board members as well. So as a president, it's a tough job because you've got to maintain that trust. You're in a unique relationship with the head, no doubt, but then you've also got to make sure that the closeness that you experience there doesn't shut out other people, if that makes sense. So all of that's just to say it's a very delicate balance, and make sure you are keeping an eye on the warning signs and then just taking advantage of some of these best practices to make sure that you're cultivating a great board culture. What are some strategies to explore? Well, first, being very intentional with how the agenda is being set for your board meetings. So now more than ever, we need to make sure that the head and the board president are saying, how do we get the biggest bang for our buck on that 60-minute or 90-minute or however long your board meetings are. Our expectations documented and reviewed annually. So onboarding of new members, critically important to make sure they understand the process. Having an annual retreat of some variety. Obviously, that looks very different this year. I lead lots of annual retreats for our schools, and we're doing them all by Zoom this year. But regardless of in-person or by distance, there does need to be an opportunity for the entire board to come together and set the goals for the year. Talk about what our priorities are. Start setting the stage for that generative conversation about enrollment management and really getting our arms around what is the 3-year projection here? What's our enrollment management look like for the next 3 years? Because that's such a huge driver in the budget and in other things as well. And then also making sure that prior to any difficult conversations, we all understand what the expectations are of each other. Finally, are you managing the clock? I've already mentioned that, but not just for the individual meeting, but are you managing the clock for the entire year? So, for example, if you've got some annual goals, are you managing how you're addressing those goals? So you're not doing just consent calendar type items all fall, and then you look up in February or March and you've got 3 board goals that we haven't looked at yet. So are you managing the clock in that way? One other comment about managing the clock. I'm starting to get more questions from board presidents about strategic planning. And this was a year where we were supposed to do strategic planning. And oh my gosh, how are we going to address that? I would just question timing at this point. And I'm not saying don't do a strategic plan right now. But before you launch a strategic planning process this fall, really think through timing and ask whether or not this is the right semester to do that in light of the other things that are going on. You may need to wait a few months. And again, I'm not saying don't do it, but that's another clock management issue. Don't be afraid to say, you know what, we've got to tweak the timeline a little bit. Just because of the reality of some other things that are going on. Okay, we talked about this a little bit. Play 2 is keeping the board focused on the main thing, which are the lanes. And we've talked about that, the importance of those lanes, and we've also talked about the reality of those lanes being a little bit blurry this year. So while boards should refrain from getting involved in operational matters, as a board, you're going to redefine some things as no longer operational, but fiduciary. If there are matters that are purely operational, then you don't have to get involved in that. But in this year, because of COVID, the definition, the categorization of what's operational and what's fiduciary may be a little more difficult. And then also make sure that the board president is positioned to assist current parents from board violations. So board violations, taking the parent hat off and putting the board member hat on is especially difficult in times of high anxiety. Well, what could be a time of high anxiety? Well, everything that we're doing right now. And so I think board presidents and heads need to expect it's going to be even more difficult this year for board parents to have their board hat on when we're talking about these kinds of issues. Guess who needs to police that? And guess who needs to hold a mirror up to that? The board president. So board presidents this year, just recognize that that may be a little more difficult than normal, but don't shy away from that. Call it out, recognize it for what it is, and don't shy away from it. The third play to call is what we call keeping the board in good running order. Ian Craig, I believe, is the head of school at Trinity Valley here in Fort Worth. Here's his perspective. Board chairs do not always understand the intricacies of how schools run. It's not their role. They do, however, need to know what leadership looks like and how to be supported. Mary Catherine and I were talking about a slide that ISM uses where they discuss good boards frequently have awesome business folks around the table. And, 60% of what applies in the business world can apply to schools. 20% doesn't apply to schools at all. And then the remaining 20% from the business world, if you apply that to the school, it will kill the community. And the board president's job is to be able to navigate that. And when you have an awesome leader or an awesome business person at the board table who's bringing perspectives from their industry to the board, there's a 60% chance that it makes total sense. There's a 20% chance that it doesn't apply, and there's another 20% chance that if you operationalize that, it's going to do harm. So just look at it through that lens whenever you're borrowing ideas from other industries. So you're going to hear me talk about a checklist here. I'm going to show you an example of a checklist, but what's your checklist look like? So we recommend that every board president basically runs off a checklist. And when you start the year, here are the things we've got to get done. Onboarding of new trustees. What are we doing to make sure our new trustees are ready to go? Are you walking them through what's been going on in the board? I just did onboarding for our board of directors. What I do is I share with them where we are in the current strategic plan. I share with them what the conversation was at the last 2 board meetings. I show them an example of a board packet so that when they get the board binder, they have a little bit of experience with navigating that. We do a little bit of work on the finances because for some board members, school finance is a little bit intimidating. And then we just make sure they have time to ask any questions. So it can be done, I've seen it done all sorts of different ways, but there does need to be formal onboarding. Let me stop there and ask Melanie and Calvin, can you share a little bit of information on what you did to onboard new members and make sure they get plugged in? So let's start with Melanie, then we'll go to Calvin.
Well, we have an annual new board member orientation that we actually are having next week. And so we do a lot of the same things that you mentioned, David. We talk also a little bit about the history of the school. So some of our people that are new to the school can learn some of the historical highlights and talk a lot about the structure and how this board of an independent school is different from a lot of other boards that they may serve on, and especially if they, the public school system or that are much more operational focused. And so, but one thing we discovered that may be helpful to people is we need to move ours up in the year so that we do it like in May rather than in August, because we also have a board retreat that's for the whole board. And we discovered this year that we needed to have brought our new members up to speed before we have that full retreat where we expect everyone to know what's going on and be able to hit the ground running with all the, the different planning going on there. So that may be something for board presidents to really consider the timing so that their new people are fully ready to start the year and go through that retreat if everyone has that in May.
So that's a great idea. So maybe do onboarding right before the summer break.
Yes.
That's a great idea.
Calvin,
what about at Trinity? What did onboarding look like, or welcoming new board members to the boardroom?
The first time when I became a new board member, we sat down, and one of the previous board members, she had all the stuff that, and did what Melanie was talking about, history of the school, what board responsibilities are, things like that. So my first year on the board, we didn't have a head of school. We had an interim, and we had the meetings after the meetings. We had things like that. And I don't want to call it a dysfunctional board, but it was close. And So when you came and did our board training to, the restaurant that we had it at, that was that was a huge turning point for our board. You physically came, you went through the entire thing. I've seen some of these slides at that, and I think everybody really got it. I had just been through a class that focused on building people up, and so everything for me, it all played in on the timing end of it.
Right.
And we had a really, really successful a year last year. But your board training that you did, that for us was invaluable. And, so we had people do it again this year. We weren't able to get together. That was one of the things I was hoping we could do as a retreat, but that kind of got shot down this year. But, maybe next year we'll be able to do that.
Yeah. So again, onboarding and board training is not something also just for new board members. Onboarding gets the new folks plugged in, but then professional development and ongoing training for the full board is equally important. So here's an example of what one board president uses as her start of the year checklist. So first thing, develop a rough map of the board meetings and the topics that are going to be explored. So this is a school that has used the consent calendar approach. So basically everything in that packet is submitted ahead of time. They take one vote to address the entire consent calendar. If there are any specific items that need to be pulled off and discussed, they do that. But the bulk of their meetings, they have a different topic every month, and they have conversations around that topic to inform their work and to inform the work of the head of school. The second thing is to schedule meetings for the two leaders to discuss school issues and board operations. So what she does is she just calendars, I can't remember if it was weekly or monthly, but they just go ahead and sit down, head of school, board president, and calendar the year out. And it can be something as easy as every second Tuesday morning we get together for coffee, or every first Friday we have breakfast, whatever. But she calendars the entire year out for both her and the head of school. And as a result, those meetings happen. They don't get canceled. They don't get moved. And that's something that's just on her checklist. Second thing is to develop a set of annual goals for the head. Now, this is done in conjunction with the Head Support and Evaluation Committee, but she's a member of the Head Support and Evaluation Committee. And so one of the first things they do is set those goals for the head. And she does that as part of she puts her ideas together and identifies what she thinks are going to be the head of school's goals, checks that off the list and brings that to the meeting of the Head Support and Evaluation Committee. Next, develop a set of annual goals for the board and the committee. So in this school, they basically identify, here are the 3 or 4 goals that we as a board want to accomplish. And then each committee gets a goal as well. And so they all work together. So, if there's 3 or 4 goals, this committee is going to be in charge of this goal. This task force is going to be in charge of this goal. But there's a tight connection between what the goals for the board will be and then how each committee will specifically play into those board goals. And then finally, she asked the question, what are we going to do about PD for the board? So sometimes that's bringing in someone in to do board training, either at one of their regular meetings or at a retreat. Sometimes that's making sure that board members have access to our webinar library and they're doing a webinar or 2. And then sometimes they do a book read. So sometimes they'll do maybe an NAIS book and they tackle that maybe 1 chapter per board meeting, and they approach it that way. So regardless, every year the question's asked, what do I need to do as the board president to set the place up for success? Okay.
Hey, David,
Yeah.
one thing I was just going to add here, and it's not a question, but it would probably be a question. Ideally for me, that stuff can and should take place, I don't know, late May, early June, rather than August. I know that we're here in August, and so I wanted to say that for those of our participants who are maybe vice presidents, it would be a good time to begin to think about that stuff in May and June, as opposed to August.
Yeah.
If you're a current board president and you haven't done any of that stuff, obviously those are things that you can start doing now. But ideally, would you say that May or June would be a better time to do? What would you say would be the best time?
Ideally. Now, again, you're in a situation where depending on our, where our participants are, if they're
Right.
working off a checklist, then that's great. They probably have already done that. I suspect not all of our participants have.
Right.
So at this point, take a look at that checklist and figure out what can I still do? I mean, most of those things are still completely, you can accomplish
For
those
sure.
now. So in an ideal world, yeah, absolutely. But, we've got some schools, I'm doing a retreat in 2 weeks. So that's, towards the end of August. And at that retreat, the board is going to establish its goals and also establish its committee goals. So yeah, in an ideal world, absolutely. That's all settled. But if you're in a situation where that hasn't been done yet, don't panic. You've got time to do that.
Good.
So, well, good. Well, we're at the top of the hour. So Mary Captain, are there any other questions or any other comments that we want to hit on at this point?
I don't have any other questions in the Q&A box, but I would just, again, I would just add that, that all of the things, all of the kind of real life experiences that Melanie and Calvin have brought to this have been great. And I think that it's really important for us to be able to see people that have boots on the ground and are in it real time right now, because our participants are.
Well, and you have heard me say we can't have strong Episcopal schools without strong Episcopal school boards. Well, and the reality is there's no way to have a strong Episcopal school board without an awesome board president. So I just want to say thank you to both Melanie and Calvin for your service, and then also to all of our participants. Thank you for the work that you're doing in your community. And please know that SAES is here to support you. Don't ever hesitate to reach out if there's anything that we can do to be of assistance to you in your all-important role of being a board president. Thank you all so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.